Welcome back to Harbour Unboxed. Today I have some more red on green violence for you. Actually, we have quite a bit of it if I'm honest. Last month I gave you guys a preview of the work that was going into creating this video by showing you the RX 480 versus GTX 1060 results. Most of you really seemed to enjoy that video, and it was great to see such a large number of you taking to the comments and having a really good discussion. Anyway, after weeks of hitting the test machine whenever I had the chance, all the results are in. From the lowly GTX 1050 and RX 460 graphics cards to the mighty wallet-crushing Titan XP. Testing so many GPUs for a single comparison throws up a few challenges, and I don't just mean simply because you have to run well over 1,000 tests. The challenge is more down to how you test and show the data. Providing an apples-to-apples comparison that includes low-end GPUs as well as extreme GPUs isn't easy, and if I'm honest, it's not really practical either. For the most part, we used ultra type quality settings, and even at 1080p, the GTX 1050 and RX 460 are better suited to medium or high quality settings in today's games. Meanwhile, graphics cards such as the Titan XP are usually CPU limited at 1080p, even when using the ultra quality settings. In the end, I decided to test at 1080p and 1440p using the maximum or near enough to maximum in-game quality settings. Realistically, these settings do lend themselves best for testing sort of mid-range hardware such as the RX 480 and GTX 1060 series, which we've already seen. So while you can compare the RX 460 and GTX 1050 in the upcoming results, I will be retesting yet again at 1080p using more suitable quality settings in the near future. The point of this video, or at least one point, is to show you just how much difference there is in performance between the current generation lineup when all things are equal. That said, for lower end GPUs, I would recommend focusing on the 1080p results as they often become crippled at 1440p for one reason or another, causing them to fall much further behind the mid-range GPUs than they would under more realistic conditions. Likewise, the GTX 1070, 1080 and Titan XP put in their best showing at 1440p, though the Titan XP would look even better had I tested at 4K as well. Since the Titan XP and GTX 1080 really are the only 4K capable GPUs, I didn't bother testing that resolution. For those results, please check any of our previous reviews featuring those GPUs. For testing, we've used our Core i7 test system, which features a Core i7 6700K processor overclocked and locked at 4.5 GHz. The latest AMD and Nvidia drivers available at the time of testing were used. In total, 16 games were tested, all of which are 2016 AAA releases. This means older games such as GTA 5, for example, were left out as they're not 2016 releases, and we've already tested these games to death. I will still test games such as GTA 5, but for this comparison, I really wanted to see how the latest AMD and Nvidia GPUs stack up in the latest games. With that, let's move on to see how they do. Released in January, Rise of the Tomb Raider was one of the, if not the, most visually impressive games released last year. Better still, it plays incredibly well on mid-range hardware when maxed out using their very high quality preset. Although Nvidia does have an engineered advantage in this title, we see that the RX 460 is able to hang there with the GTX 1050. Moving to 1440p, the mid-range cards do suffer at times, falling into the mid-30s. Here the high-end GTX 1070 offers a real nice performance boost over the GTX 1060 and RX 480 GPUs. The tranquil environments that can be enjoyed in Far Cry Primal get me every time. I'll stop for just a moment to enjoy a nice river with a rocky backdrop, and then BAM! An angry doll appears out of nowhere and tries to make a meal of me. Thankfully they have glass jaws and go down easier than an MMA fighter that's tried to stay in the game too long. Anyway, getting to the data at hand, we see that the mid-range contenders were able to deliver around 60 FPS at 1080p using the ultra quality settings. The GTX 1050 series isn't bad either, while the RX 460 falls behind in this title. Jumping to 1440p, you will want a GTX 1070 to push over 60 FPS. Meanwhile, if 100 FPS is more your jam, then a Titan XP is more the shot, though buying one of those things right now might give you the urge to self-terminate in a few weeks' time. After much hype, The Division was also released back in March. Sadly, it was quickly discovered that Ubisoft's repetitive gameplay strikes again. Apparently a new patch has made the game much better, but once you quit the grind, you never go back, I say. Anyway, the game does now support the DirectX 12 API, and since we saw no negative impact on performance for the Nvidia GPUs, this is how I'll be testing the game going forward. Please note, I am using a longer, more demanding pass to test the game now, and this seems to have swung the results slightly in Nvidia's favour when comparing the RX 480 and GTX 1060. No, this wasn't done to favour Nvidia, that's just how the results with this more in-depth test turned out. Overall, it's fair to say that the mid-range RX 480 and GTX 1060 GPUs deliver a similar experience. The GTX 1050 and RX 460 appear to be neck and neck in this one, while the 1050 Ti gets stomped by the RX 470. Moving to 1440p, the RX 480 skips slightly ahead of the GTX 1060. For those wanting an average of 60 FPS, the GTX 1070 will be required, though it has to be said that the GTX 1080 provides a noticeably better experience again. Hitman is one of those games where we test AMD cards using DirectX 12 and Nvidia cards using DirectX 11. This is a testing method that fanboys seem to really love. Anyway, as I've said before, I test some games this way for a few reasons. First and foremost, no GeForce owner will run the game using DirectX 12, as there is nothing to gain. Rather, you just lose a few frames. Secondly, we know Nvidia GPUs don't do well in DirectX 12. We've proved this time and time again. We did so first back in 2015 with the Ashes of Singularity game. Also, this isn't a game that really needs DirectX 12 support, providing you have a balanced system. In my opinion, games such as Ashes really do need the support of a low-level API regardless of the GPU used. There aren't thousands of human or AI-controlled characters getting around at any one point in Hitman, so the CPU doesn't get hit nearly as hard. Finally, Nvidia GPUs can be seen underperforming in Hitman when using either DX11 or DX12. This is an AMD-supported title. As you can see, the RX 480, for example, easily beats the GTX 1060 when looking at the average frame rate. That said, the minimums are quite close. Moving to 1440p, the Radeon GPU seem to pull further ahead, though the GTX 1050 is able to beat out the 2GB RX 460. Also, here the GTX 1070 is just 27% faster than the RX 480 8GB. Quantum Break is another game that should never be played using the DirectX 12 API with an Nvidia GPU. We saw at least a 10 FPS boost for the mid-range GeForce GPUs when moving from the Windows Store DX12 version to the Steam DX11 version. Meanwhile, the AMD cards deliver the exact same performance using either DX11 or DX12. For those wondering, when running the DX12 version on the GTX 1060 cards, they are slightly slower than the RX 480s. Meanwhile, using Steam's DX11 build, the GTX 1060 is able to pull well ahead. Interestingly, at 1080p, the GTX 1070 isn't even 15% faster than the GTX 1060 in this title. Kim Kardashian thought her bumper stopper got some attention, then Tracer came along and the internet went into a fizz. Not wanting to fall out of the limelight, Tracer recently announced that she actually plays for the other team. But I guess that's not really a big deal in today's day and age, is it? Right? Anyway, moving on, this is another Nvidia special, and we see that the GTX 1060 and GTX 1050 series are able to outpace their AMD rivals. Still, with the RX 460 2GB pushing over 60 FPS at 1080p using the ultra quality settings, this isn't exactly a big deal. For over 60 FPS at 1440p, you will require a GTX 1050 Ti. That said, for those rocking a high refresh rate display, something like the GTX 1070 will still be in order. It really is crazy how underwhelming the Radeon GPUs were in Doom when using OpenGL, given how overpowered they are when using Vulkan. That said, it is interesting to note that although Nvidia's GPUs featuring only 2GB of memory really suffer in this title at 1080p, using the ultra quality preset, 2GB AMD GPUs fare considerably worse. This can be seen when comparing the 2GB variants of the RX 460 and GTX 1050. Moving to 1440p, the GTX 1060 6GB is only able to match the performance of the RX 470 4GB in this title when using the Vulkan API. Still, those with deep pockets will be best served by Nvidia's Titan XP, which remains locked at 200 FPS, even at 1440p. Like Ashes of the Singularity, Total War Warhammer is another game that I feel should be played using the DirectX 12 API, with either AMD or Nvidia hardware. That being the case, I've tested all graphics cards using the DirectX 12 API with the unlimited video memory option enabled. Interestingly, at 1080p using the very high quality settings, the RX 460 suffers massive frame dips in both the 2GB and 4GB configurations. In spite of that, the RX 470 was able to beat both the GTX 1060 3GB and 6GB versions. Moving to 1440p, we see similar performance trends, though here the RX 470 does drop behind the 6GB 1060 to match the 3GB model. Mirror's Edge Catalyst provides a close battle between the mid-range and low-end GPUs. The mid-range contenders all pushed over 60 FPS at 1080p using the ultra quality preset, while the RX 460 and base model GTX 1050 were limited to frame rates in the mid-30s. At 1440p, the mid-range GPUs struggle a bit, making the GTX 1070 a more desirable option here. Even so, the GTX 1080 offers huge performance gains over the 1070, while the Titan XP is faster again, as you would expect. Here we see some very competitive performance in F1 2016. The RX 460 and GTX 1050 deliver a similar experience, as did the RX 480 and GTX 1060, with the RX 470 also getting amongst it. For perfectly playable performance at 1080p using the ultra quality preset, I recommend a mid-range GPU such as the RX 470. Now at 1440p we find much the same. That said, ideally gamers will want a GTX 1070 or faster for perfectly smooth performance at all times. Deus Ex Mankind Divided was tested exclusively using the DirectX 12 API, since Nvidia GPUs deliver the same performance using either DirectX 11 or DirectX 12 in this title, so it seems plausible that GeForce owners would use DirectX 12 here. Anyway, as an AMD supported title, the Radeons tend to run away with it, as the RX 460 just beats the GTX 1050, and the same can be said for the RX 480 in relation to the GTX 1060. That said, for gamers seeking even greater frame rates, the GTX 1070 offers a nice boost. Gaming at 1440p using the second highest quality preset does really require a GTX 1080, which is pretty shocking. Of course, gamers can reduce the quality settings further to the high preset, and to be honest, this doesn't really sacrifice the visuals too heavily. Battlefield 1's another game where I have tested the AMD cards using DirectX 12 and the Nvidia cards using DirectX 11. Truth be told, we have shown in the past that Nvidia GPUs deliver the same performance using DirectX 11 and DirectX 12 in this title, though the frame times do seem more consistent overall when using DirectX 11. For the most part, the AMD GPUs do enjoy a small performance boost when using the DX12 API. Overall, performance between the GTX 1060 and RX 480 GPUs is much the same whichever way you look at it. Meanwhile, the GTX 1050 is able to pull a little ahead of the RX 460. Even at 1440p in this visually impressive game, the mid-range GPUs are able to deliver over 60 FPS on average, the only exception being the RX 470, though it has to be said, even at this resolution, it's still very impressive. For going beyond 60 FPS though, you will require a GTX 1070. Well, they are trying guys, but I'm not sure free DLC is what this game needs. Let's shoot for a performance patch next time, 2K Games. If the GTX 1060 can push 90 FPS at 1080p in the maxed out Battlefield 1, is it too much to ask for a solid 60 FPS in Mafia III? Right now, if you want to stay around 60 FPS, you'll have to shell out for a GTX 1070, and we're talking about the 1080p performance here. It is also worth pointing out that at present Nvidia GPUs do have a rather large advantage in this poorly optimised title. Forget 1440p gaming with all the bells and whistles turned on unless you have a GTX 1080 or Titan XP. I can't believe the GTX 1060 and RX 480 are only pushing around 30 FPS here. Gears of War 4 is a DirectX 12 only title, so naturally both AMD and Nvidia GPUs have been tested using this API. Here we see the same 84 FPS from both the GTX 1060 and RX 480, while the 4GB 480 is 6 FPS faster than the 3GB 1060. Bumping the resolution up to 1440p, we are still able to achieve playable performance on the mid-range GPUs, but for the more desirable 60 FPS performance, I would recommend a GTX 1070. In my opinion, Titanfall 2 ended up being a much better game than expected. Even the single player campaign was quite fun and surprisingly lengthy. Anyway, the other great thing about this game is how well it plays on the PC. Using the very high quality preset, the RX 460 and GTX 1050 both averaged 61 FPS. Meanwhile, the mid-range contenders were pushing into the 80s. Even at 1440p, those rocking an RX 480 or GTX 1060 will consistently see frame rates in the 60s. The Civilization 6 results from the previous RX 480 vs GTX 1060 video have been dropped and replaced with these results using the new patched-in DirectX 12 support, so they won't be comparable. Previously, the GeForce GPUs were slightly faster using DirectX 11, but now with DirectX 12 support, AMD is able to match Nvidia in this title, at least when comparing the RX 480 and GTX 1060. The GTX 1050 does still lead the RX 460, meanwhile the 1070, 1080 and Titan XP are only able to offer slightly stronger minimum frame rates. We're obviously running into a CPU bottleneck at 1080p. Surprisingly, even at 1440p, the higher end Nvidia cards are still limited to the same performance. In fact, despite increasing the resolution, the performance trends remain all much the same. Call of Duty Infinite Warfare is another late 2016 release that allowed AMD to come home strong. Here the RX 480 leads the GTX 1060 by a reasonable margin, and the RX 460 is even able to close in on the GTX 1050. Although the RX 460 did only average 44 FPS, the RX 480 8GB was good for 86 FPS. Even at 1440p, the RX 480 remains very strong, and here we see the 4GB model sticking with the 8GB version, allowing it to beat the GTX 1060. Once again though, we find that those wanting to stay above 60 FPS at all times, the GTX 1070 will be required. Since our initial Dishonored 2 testing, the game's performance has dramatically improved, particularly those minimum frame rates. It is also worth noting that the section of the game we test isn't that demanding on the CPU, and yet we still find that higher end GPUs are being limited at 1080p. For that reason, the 1070 isn't that much faster than the 1060, while the 1080 and Titan XP are only a few frames faster than the 1070. Nevertheless, Nvidia does appear to enjoy a rather large performance advantage in this title at this time. Even at 1440p, the GTX 1070, 1080 and Titan XP are all performance limited. Meanwhile, the 3GB 1060 is able to best the 8GB RX 480, while the 1050 easily beats the RX 460. Finally, the last game tested was Watch Dogs 2, and here we see some very consistent performance scaling from the slowest GPUs tested to the fastest. Again, Nvidia appears to have a reasonable performance advantage in this game, as the GTX 1060 comfortably beats the RX 480. Upping the resolution to 1440p, we find that gamers will really require a GTX 1070 to enjoy perfectly smooth performance. Meanwhile, the GTX 1080 was another 20% faster, while the Titan XP was almost 50% faster. As I noted last time, the power figures aren't really going to change, and it doesn't really make sense to benchmark the AMD cards using the new Radeon Chill feature, as this will make them look considerably slower than they really are. At idle, the GeForce cards consumed around 10 watts less, and under low we see quite a large difference in Nvidia's favour. Here we see the RX 480 8GB does consume more power than the GTX 1070, and not a great deal less than the GTX 1080. So now that we have all the data in, how do these GPUs compare overall? Well, for this video, I won't do our normal breakdown, like what you would have seen in the RX 480 versus GTX 1060 video, because we'd be here all week doing that kind of breakdown. Instead, I'll just compare the average frame rates from all 19 games as an average figure in the following graph. This should give you a pretty good idea of how much faster or slower one GPU is from another. Right, so the light blue bars represent 1080p performance, with the darker blue showing the average 1440p results. Something that jumps out at me right away here is the GTX 1050 and RX 460 results. Granted, for the most part the quality settings used were a bit too extreme. Here we see that the 1050 is just 13% faster than the 460 when comparing the 2GB models. That does sound like a bit, and while it is, in our previous 23 game comparison the GeForce GPU was 18% faster. So the margin has reduced, and with the Relive driver offering around a 4 to 5% performance boost in quite a few titles, this driver improvement along with the better game support for Radeon GPUs really is helping AMD. Something else you might have noticed is that although the GTX 1060 6GB was 1% faster than the RX 480 8GB in our previous video, the Radeon GPU is now 2% faster. Causing this small difference is down to a few changes made to the testing. Whereas the GTX 1060 was previously 9% faster in the Civilization 6 test, it's now on par with the RX 480 thanks to the DirectX 12 update. That change has also seen the GTX 1060 3GB model now trailing the RX 480 4GB by a 5% margin, whereas previously it was just 2% slower. Meanwhile, the RX 470 was just 4% slower than the 3GB 1060, and with it priced around 15% lower, this is why we named it the best value sub $200 GPU back in November. At 1440p, the GTX 1070 was 37% faster than the GTX 1060. Not bad, but it does cost at least 50% more, so gamers are paying a fair premium for that silky smooth 1440p gaming experience. The situation is much the same again when going from the 1070 to the 1080. You get a little over 20% more performance, but you have to pay a little over 50% more to get it. This of course isn't new information. We found the exact same margins back in June last year. Well, I think that's a pretty good summary of the current performance gamers can expect from these GPUs, at least in relation to one another. As I said earlier, I will be retesting the RX 460 and GTX 1050 using more appropriate quality settings. And as a bit of a side note for that upcoming test, for those wondering, I will not be throwing in an RX 460 with an unlocked BIOS. The reason being that one of my two RX 460s failed the unlock, forcing me to roll back the BIOS. That in itself isn't an issue, the real issue being that the Relive driver looks for an AMD BIOS signature for Polaris-based cards, and without it the drivers won't work. There is a rather complex workaround using a modded driver, but honestly for a lousy up to 5% performance bump, is it worth the hassle every time AMD releases a new driver, which at the moment is every other week. So for now at least, I personally don't think the RX 460 unlock method is worth pursuing. No doubt there will be some of you that disagree with me, but that's my opinion. And anyway, let's not get too bogged down with that for now. The good news for shoppers is currently it looks very competitive in the low-end to mid-range market segment, so this will be great for pricing. Moving forward, it's going to get pretty crazy this year on the GPU front, and I anticipate many more late nights benchmarking. Also, as new games and drivers are released, I will continue to update my results and make new comparison videos along the way, so stay tuned for those. I'm your host Steve, and I'll catch you on the next one.